Hi, my name's Denali Culver. What's your name?
My name is Chuck Culver.
Okay, so, how many years have you lived in Alaska?
I was born up here, but I moved out for a while, so I've actually lived in Alaska 40 years.
Okay. In those years, did you witness any of the major natural disasters that occurred?
Yes, I was present during the 1964 earthquake, which was the largest earthquake ever recorded in North America. I was also present for several volcanic eruptions that left ash over the city of Anchorage. And I was present the year of the Great Flood in Fairbanks in '67.
Wow. How did seeing or being present for these things affect you?
Well, the earthquake in particular affected me. It lasted for almost 5.5 minutes, and as you know, it was very strong. And I was 9 years old at the time, and I remember exactly what I was doing. I remember it distinctly, and it just felt like the whole world was ending. So, ever since then, for the most part, I've been very leery of earthquakes.
What were you doing when it happened?
I was putting together a model of PT-109, and I was watching a show on TV called Johnny Quest, and getting ready to watch a show called Fireball XL5.
Could you see the effects of the earthquake?
Yeah, we lived downtown on the Park Strip, and they were building a 10 or 12 story concrete building kitty corner from us at the site of the original hospital. And we were able to look out the front window and watch that building, that 10, 12 story building, fall over on 3 blocks of residential neighborhoods.
Wow. So, tell me about your family and what it was like to grow up here.
Well, my father came to Alaska in the mid-1930s. He took a job working for Cap Lathrop and built the first radio tower in Fairbanks. And then after that decided to stay up here and went to work for the CAA, which was the Civil Aeronautics Administration, which ultimately became the FAA, the Federal Aeronautics Administration. And so he basically had a hand in building most of the airports throughout the state of Alaska. And my mother came to Alaska in the mid-40s during the war, after the Alcan Highway was built by the Army. She was a secretary with a construction company called Morrison Knudsen, and she came up here to help work on refining and improving the road. And so both my parents have been here since the mid-20th century, early part of the mid-20th century. And Anchorage was a pretty small place. I mean, for the most part, when I was growing up, Anchorage was probably a town of 25 to 40,000 people. When my dad came up here in the mid-30s, I imagine Anchorage was probably less than 10,000. So it was a very a homey feeling. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody gave everybody rides. You couldn't get away with anything as a kid. So it was a very warm, everybody looked out for everybody environment, and then that all changed with the discovery of oil in the pipeline in the early 70s.
Which regions of Alaska have you visited?
Well, I personally have been to Western Alaska. I spent a couple of years off and on out in Bethel and Talooksack and several other villages along the Kuskokwim. I've been to the central part of Alaska. I've been up at Fairbanks a couple of times. And of course, I was born and raised in and around Anchorage. We went down to Seward a lot, and Kenai and Homer. And then I also spent a fair amount of time in southeastern Alaska, both on the Marine Ferry and then flying into Juneau. And but I was able to also visit through the Marine Highway, Ketchikan, Sitka, Skagway, and all the various communities down there.
Was there any specific reason you visited these places?
Well, work is what took me to Western Alaska. And then when I was a kid, following my parents, that's when I spent a lot of time in the Kenai Peninsula and up in Fairbanks. Southeastern Alaska, most of my time there was when I was going to and from school to college and coming back to work in Alaska in the summers. Also, my work took me north too. I've spent some time in Nome and Kotzebue, again related to building schools.
How many schools have you built? Do you remember?
Well, in Alaska, I worked on 3 school projects during when I was working for commercial construction firms up here on my return.
Have you built anything else up here?
Well, I've built a cabin at Nancy Lake for the family that I've been working on for the last 5 or 6 years while I was retired. But most of my construction career was when I left Alaska, when I was outside in the state of Washington for 18 years.
Okay. What are some of your favorite Alaska memories?
Oh, probably some of my favorite Alaskan memories would be the holidays where we would get together with several other families for Thanksgiving and Christmas and celebrate. And there were usually large gatherings of 18 or 20 people, because back then most people couldn't afford to go home for holidays. So you had a lot of orphan families, and they would get together and celebrate the holidays together. And then, later when I got older, I grew to kind of not like it. When I was younger, we camped and fished all the time, and so I have vivid memories of camping and fishing at various places throughout central Alaska. And fireworks back then, when fireworks were still pretty potent. I have lots of memories as a young child of getting into trouble with fireworks.
What are some of your least favorite memories?
Well, I guess, least favorite, that's kind of hard to say. I mean, the earthquake certainly was not a favorite memory. I mean, it was something I wish I would have avoided. But that was one of them. Some of the long winters would get to you now and then the changes that Anchorage went through when oil was discovered in the North Slope. People stopped picking up hitchhikers, and there was a lot of riffraff, and there was a lot of money going around, and people had more money than they had sense to spend, and Anchorage kind of doubled overnight, and it became a different state. There were a lot of outsiders that came in, and some of the homespun nature of Anchorage just kind of disappeared, and I don't quite think it's ever returned.
Did you have any interesting interactions with wildlife?
One of the families that we used to go camping with a lot was a well-known photographer in the state. His name was Ward Wells. And in addition to doing portraits and whatnot, he was also a very well-known wildlife photographer. In fact, many of his photographs are on display at the Anchorage Museum. And we used to go camping with him and his wife, Jen, almost every weekend in the summer. And I remember one time we were down in Ski Lac Lake, actually two occasions on Ski Lac Lake. One where he took me out in his boat to one of the Arctic tern islands where the Arctic terns lay their nests. And we got to go walk on that island where there was probably thousands of tern nests. And you had to just watch to make sure you didn't step in one. And then another occasion was when a cow moose and her calf came into camp. And you wouldn't do this at all today, I recommend it, but making sure that we never got between the cow and the calf, or that the cow was always between us and the calf. We got to approach it, and I was able to almost get close enough to touch the cow, and that was my first experience with moose.
How old were you when that happened?
I was probably somewhere in the range of 8 to 10.
Is there anything about Alaska that you wish was different, whether it be socially, economically, or politically?
I wish we could do a better. I wish Alaska had more infrastructure and could create more value-added products. I mean, to date, the history of Alaska is one of resource exploitation and exportation of raw materials, and in the long run, that's not going to do the state a service. I guess that's the big one there.
So you already mentioned how much the oil changed the way Alaska is, but how else has it changed in your time here?
How else has what changed Alaska?
Mm-hmm.
Well, roads are much improved. Again, I mentioned earlier we have a cabin at Nancy Lake. We can get up there door to door now in about an hour and 30 minutes. And when I was a kid, we used to go up to Big Lake or Nancy Lake, and it was often a 2 or 3 hour affair, taking the old highway, and everything was a 2-lane road. So one, transportation is much improved. The availability of goods and services is much improved. It used to be that getting fresh vegetables up here was a pretty hard chore, and there was a smorgasbord every Sunday out at the Anchorage International Airport where one of the major airlines would fly up fresh fruit and vegetables from Seattle. And that was a very well-received thing, that families would go out of their way to go to dinner there on Sunday night, because it was one of the few ways to get decent produce. Because in the early days, everything either had to come up on steamship or through several hops on a DC-3 or something. Whereas now with the jets and everything else, 7, 8, 9, 10 trips a day, it's rather easy to get fresh produce.
You said that you had gone up to Big Lake a lot with your family. Has anything with Big Lake changed?
We spent a lot of time at Big Lake and Nancy Lake recreating when I was a teenager. Um, yeah, Big Lake's changed a lot. I mean, when I was a kid on Big Lake, it was a very dangerous place. I think there was 7 bars on the lake, and drinking was freely encouraged amongst boaters. At any given point in time, there would be several boats out on the lake whose drivers probably should not have been driving. You really had to watch out for yourself. That's definitely changed.
Okay. Where have you lived outside of Alaska?
Well, I lived in Southern California for several years where I went to college, and then I lived in Chicago for 3 years. I was going to graduate school, and then I went back and lived in LA for a couple of years after graduate school. And then when I moved out for 18 years, I moved to Eastern Washington, which is where my wife was from. And we lived for quite a few years in Yakima in Eastern Washington, and then we moved down briefly to Bend, Oregon, before returning to Alaska.
How does Alaska differ from these places?
Well, I think one is just the vastness and the closeness of nature. There's aren't very many major cities of 250,000 people where moose walk down Main Street routinely. The other one they've discovered recently is just the bear population in and around Anchorage is much higher than they thought at very busy intersections, like out in Tudor where Campbell Creek is. And then the moose population, I think they estimate that there's like 1,200 moose that winter in Kincaid Park in the Anchorage area in the winter. So I mean, the closest to wildlife and the natural setting, I think, and the still somewhat pristine nature of the state is the big difference.
Is there anything from those states that you experienced that you wish you could bring to Alaska? The ease of personal transportation. I mean, obviously, which you can't do, but I mean, the fact that in most of the lower 48, if you want to go visit something, you can fly or you can hop in your car and drive there. In Alaska, the hop in the car and drive option is not really a real option. If you want to go somewhere, you pretty much have to get on an airplane. Yeah. Thinking back over the years, if you could bring back 3 famous Alaskans and invite them to dinner, who would you pick and why?
Wow. Well, I guess one of them would be Don Shelton, Sheldon. He was a famous Alaskan bush pilot when I was a kid. He was one of the first bush pilots to successfully land on Mount McKinley to take hikers up there. And he operated out of Talkeetna and kind of pioneered, I guess, high altitude glacier landings and whatnot in bush planes. So it'd be interesting to have him to dinner. I met him a couple of times when I was a kid, but just to hear his stories and the thrill of what it would be like to do that for the first time. So he'd be one of them. I think Elmer Rasmussen would be another one. I think I did meet him once or twice as a child, but I'd be interested to interview him. Actually his father founded it, but he was the one that made First National Bank of Alaska into what it was. He was a well-educated man. He had a steamship company in the early days of Alaska, and he ended up leaving his financial legacy as the Rasmussen Foundation, which I think is worth some $400 million. It's one of the first major multimillionaires in Alaska. And today they do a lot of goodwill things, funding various activities in and around the state. I guess the final gentleman, just to get something different, would be Cap Lathrop. Cap Lathrop was the gentleman that brought my father up here in the 30s, but he came up here and actually I guess it was Cap that had the steamship company, maybe not Rasmussen. But anyway, he came up here and did a variety of things in a variety of towns until finally opening up a movie theater. I think in Cordova was the first one. And he later came and opened movie theaters in Anchorage called the Lathrop Theaters, and he opened up a Lathrop Theater in Fairbanks, and ended up owning the Fairbanks News Miner newspaper. And he was instrumental in bringing entertainment to the state of Alaska. And he was also one of the few people that, not few, but he was also one of the strong people that opposed statehood. He didn't think statehood was going to be good for Alaska. He thought it would create more regulation and taxes. But anyhow, I think he was a very interesting person, and obviously another somebody that had a great deal to do with changing Alaska.
What would you say is the best part of being a long-term Alaskan?
That would have to be the memories of what Alaska was like when it was small, and and people really kind of banded together against the environment and were very willing to help each other, and just the small town nature of Alaska, which has kind of been lost to antiquity now.
What would you say is the worst part
Worst part of what?
of being long-term Alaskan?
I don't really know if there is a worst part other than you maybe didn't get to see or do as many things in your youth as kids in other states maybe did because of a lack of easy transportation outside of the state. But other than that, I really can't imagine what would be the worst.
If you were chosen as a guest speaker in Alaska Studies class, what would you select as the 3 most important lessons of our history since statehood?
Since statehood?
Yes.
Well, I think the first one would have to be to trying to figure out ways to diversify and not be totally dependent on raw materials and resources, is basically being an exporter of raw materials. To try to develop a service sector and hopefully try to look for ways to create an economy within ourselves. I guess the other one would be figuring out how to work with and deal with the indigenous populations of the state. And by that I'm referring to the Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act. That was something that had never really been done at that level before for an indigenous population of the other states in the lower 48. And I think we're still coming to grips with the impact of that and the effect it's having on the economy. And I think the other lesson is, we've tried to be a state to all peoples and tried to let everybody do what they wanted to do. And Alaska is so remote and has so many remote locales, it just is not economically feasible to maintain a good deal of these remote locales and provide the basic services and whatever that people have come to expect as part of being a member of the United States of America. And we've pretty much solved that problem to date by relying heavily on the federal government to take care of us, as well as our oil taxes to pay for some of it. And I think in the future, I think we're seeing through this current recession we've gone through that the money just isn't there to totally always be dependent on the kindness of others and the welfare of others. And I think moving forward in the state, we're going to have to realize that, at least in the near term, I think we're going to have to shrink in terms of our geographic location within the state, and I think we're going to have to consolidate into a smaller number of major city areas just for economic reasons.
What are the 2 most important issues Alaskans should focus on in the 21st century?
2?
Yeah.
Well, I've kind of hit on this several times. I think the economic is the biggest thing we need to focus on. How can we make the state something other than an exporter of raw materials? Because we're seeing that we've had timber, but we weren't able to produce in value add refined timber in the state. We just exported logs. We found oil and we exported oil, and now that's starting to slow down, and we can't seem to force new production because there's plenty of other places in the world to look for oil. We had gold that we've extracted, and silver and platinum, which we're still extracting, but we haven't found a way to refine or value add those minerals here in the state. And now we're looking at the Pebble Mine, which I think could have devastating long-term implications for the state. We're obviously looking at it because it's a potential source of revenue, but I think we need to look for other ways where we can do value-added economic interests and make the state a little bit more self-viable. I guess the other one would be that we need to figure how to become less dependent on tax revenue to provide for us, and also we need to figure out a way that if we are going to continue to extract raw materials, that we're extracting them for the full benefit of Alaskans. Right now a good deal of our raw materials, even our tourism industry, benefits the vast majority of Alaskans very little. These companies that have come in here to provide tourism or have come in here to extract our materials, our minerals, have done so by making fully vertically integrated companies, and very little people outside of their entities are really profiting from that opportunity. And I think that's something that we need to take a really hard look at.
Thank you for letting me interview you. It was really great. hear your
Okay.
opinions.
Bye.